The iron pipe was less than a hand's width from the old woman's temple when Della Hartley did the one thing that would send her entire life down a different path. It was 9:45 on a rain-lashed November night in Chicago's South Loop, and 3 masked men had just kicked their way into Maddox's Corner, a small breakfast diner, just as it was about to close. They hadn't come for money. They had come to send a message to make the whole neighborhood understand who held the power now. But when one of them swung the pipe toward the silver-haired old woman sitting quietly in the corner, Della didn't think for even a second. She threw herself forward, putting her own body between the pipe and the stranger. She had no idea the old woman was Margaret Marlowe, mother of Lucian Marlowe, one of the most powerful, wealthy, and cold-hearted men in Chicago's underworld. A man whose name alone made the boldest of criminals lower their fists. She had no way of knowing that within a few short hours, this one instinctive act would bind her fate to a family she had never dared to imagine. But 12 hours before that fateful moment, Della Hartley was simply a 27-year-old waitress, counting her loose change and quietly praying that her gravely ill foster mother would live to see one more day. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it to spread a little kindness to others. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story worth telling. That morning began like every other morning at Maddox's Corner, which meant it began with a problem that had no answer. Della Hartley flipped the sign on the front door to open at 6 o'clock sharp, then stood still for a moment, looking out at Wabash Street, still soaked from the rain that had fallen through the night. At this hour, the South Loop was empty and quiet, with only the distant groan of the elevated train somewhere above the streets, and the weak yellow glow of lights spilling through the glass, blurred by a film of moisture. She drew in a breath, pulled the apron behind her back and tied it, then stepped into yet another workday, one of so many she had long since stopped trying to count. The diner was small, with only 12 seats, and yet Della carried nearly all of it on her own shoulders. She brewed coffee, baked pastries, served tables, wiped counters, rang up checks, washed dishes, all by herself through shifts that stretched as long as 14 hours. The old kitchen helper had quit the month before because Cora no longer had the money to pay wages, and Della had never told her foster mother that she'd quietly taken on that work too, without asking for even 1 extra cent. She opened the cash drawer and counted the loose money left from the day before, $218. She counted it again, slowly, as if looking more carefully might make the bills multiply on their own, but the number stayed the same. The bill for the vegetables and eggs being delivered that morning was $340, due the moment the order arrived. The rent was already 8 days late, and the new landlord who had bought the building had called twice, his voice colder each time. Then there was Cora's next dialysis treatment on Thursday, and even after insurance paid its part, the family still had to come up with nearly $1,000. Della did the math in her head, adding and adding again, and every time the answer was the same empty space, swallowing every dollar she earned. She closed the drawer gently, as if afraid the sound might wake something worse. Maddox's Corner had once been a different place. Cora Maddox had opened the diner 31 years earlier with the money she'd saved after half a lifetime of waiting tables for other people. She wanted a place where the coffee was always hot, the plates were always full, and people were treated kindly whether they ordered a hearty meal or only a glass of water. For years, the diner had been filled with regulars, construction workers stopping in for breakfast before their shifts, elderly women from the neighborhood settling in for half the morning over a cup of tea. But the neighborhood was changing day by day. Luxury apartment buildings rose on every corner, pushing the old families away and replacing them with people who only stopped in long enough to photograph their food, then complain because the diner didn't have Wi-Fi. The customers thinned out little by little. There were mornings when Della stood behind the counter, staring at rows of empty tables, her heart tightening because she knew exactly how much money they needed each day just to break even, and they hadn't broken even in a long time. Cora now lay upstairs, too weak to come down the stairs on most days. Kidney disease had drained the strength out of her, turning the woman who had once stood behind the counter for 12 straight hours into a fragile shadow beneath a blanket. Every morning before opening, Della went upstairs to check on her, set her medicine and a glass of water beside the bed, and pressed a hand to her mother's forehead to make sure she was still warm, still breathing evenly. This morning, Cora was awake. She took Della's hand, her voice hoarse, but still trying to make a joke, saying that without Della, the customers would all run for the door. Della smiled, a smile she'd practiced until it looked almost real, then told her mother to rest, that everything downstairs was fine. It was the kindest lie she knew how to tell. People often said Della was strong, but she knew she simply didn't have any other choice. At 16, Cora had taken her in after long years of being passed from one foster home to another, and for the first time in her life, Della had a place to call home, a last name to carry, and someone who called her daughter. She'd never forgotten that debt of love. So now, with the woman who had saved her life lying helpless upstairs, Della was willing to work herself to the edge of collapse, willing to count every loose coin, willing to swallow every fear and bury it deep inside, as long as she could keep both her mother and the diner alive for one more day. She hung the wiping cloth over her shoulder, glanced at the clock on the wall, then turned to welcome the first customer who had just pushed open the door. The customer came in at nearly 9 o'clock, just as she had been doing twice a week for the past several months. The silver-haired old woman sat down at the small table by the window in the far corner, where the morning light slipped through the narrow gap in the curtains just enough to touch the tabletop, and she ordered exactly what she always ordered: 1 cup of black coffee, no sugar. Della was so used to it by now that she didn't need to ask anymore. She poured the coffee, set it down in front of the woman with both hands, and the old woman looked up and thanked her in a voice that was soft yet warm, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had lived long enough to understand that small, ordinary kindnesses were what kept people standing. Della didn't know the woman's real name. On the check, she always wrote simply Mrs. Margaret, because once the woman had introduced herself as Margaret and left it at that, no last name, no further questions. She never caused trouble, always left a proper tip, and now and then even pressed a few extra dollars into Della's hand with a quiet remark that the girl worked far too hard. What caught Della's attention wasn't the way she drank her coffee, but the questions she had begun asking lately. Soft, careful questions, as if she were practicing how to care about ordinary things after a long time of being given no chance to care about anyone at all. "Is your mother feeling any better today, dear?" she asked, her eyes lifting toward the ceiling where Cora lay upstairs in the room above. "Has business been any better lately?" Della never knew how to answer truthfully. Her mother wasn't any better. The diner wasn't doing any better either. But people didn't say those things out loud, so she only smiled and said they were still holding on, then turned away to tend to another table. There was one thing Della had noticed that she couldn't explain, and it had lingered in her mind ever since. A few times, when Cora forced herself downstairs to sit in the diner for a little while and clear her head, Mrs. Margaret would stop what she was doing, set her coffee cup down, and look toward Della's foster mother with a very strange expression. It wasn't the look of one stranger studying another stranger. There was something heavy in it, something that seemed at once sorrowful, troubled, and burdened by an old story that had never been fully told. Once, Cora looked up and caught that gaze, and for a brief moment, the two older women both went still, as if there were an invisible thread between them that only they could feel. Then Cora gave a small nod of greeting, and Mrs. Margaret nodded back, quietly, without a single word. Della had meant to ask her mother about that customer one day, but work swept her away, and she forgot again. That morning, while Mrs. Margaret was still sitting with her cup of coffee, slowly going cold, the diner door swung open, and a well-dressed man stepped inside, carrying with him the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to putting a price on everything. He didn't order anything. He asked to see the owner, and when Della said Cora was resting upstairs, he merely smiled, placed a business card on the counter, and said he represented Mr. Desmond Pike, the man who wanted to purchase the entire row of buildings, and that Mrs. Maddox should seriously consider the offer before things became more difficult for both sides. His voice was polite, but behind that politeness was a warning that didn't need to be spoken plainly. Della picked up the business card and felt her hand grow faintly cold. She had heard the name Desmond Pike in passing, the man behind half the new buildings rising in the neighborhood, the man who pushed people out, not with open threats, but with money, paperwork, and contracts the poor couldn't afford to fight. The man walked out, leaving behind a heavy silence. When Della turned back, she saw Mrs. Margaret watching his shadow disappear beyond the glass door, her face suddenly tightening, her usually gentle eyes flashing with something sharp and distant, as if she understood better than anyone just how dangerous the name that had just been spoken truly was. When night fell and closing time approached, the storm outside raged harder, and that was when the nightmare began. For one long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the whole diner sank into a frightening silence, and the three men froze before the one thing none of them had expected: the sight of a young woman rushing forward to shield the old lady with her own body. The man holding the rod lowered his hand a little, and his eyes behind the cloth covering his face flickered with confusion, as if there had never been room in their plan for someone who dared to stand in their way. Della didn't step back. She held her ground, her arms slightly spread, forcing her voice to remain steady even though her heart was thrashing wildly inside her chest, and told them that whatever they wanted, they could take it, that the money was in the drawer, but please leave the old woman alone. She didn't have anything worth hurting her for. One of the men near the door shouted that they didn't need the loose change from some diner that was about to collapse anyway, that this was only a message to teach the whole neighborhood to behave, and then he knocked over the nearest stack of chairs to prove his point. The sound of the chairs crashing against the floor rang harsh and sharp through the cramped little diner. The man with the rod took another step forward, and Della felt the coldness of that iron bar right in front of her face. But still, she didn't move, because behind her was a silver-haired woman trembling as she clung to the edge of the table, and Della knew that if she stepped back, there would be no one left standing between that woman and these men. Just then, from somewhere in the distance, a siren began to wail. The unmistakable sound of a Chicago police car cutting through the rain, coming closer and closer, echoing off the wet walls of the street. The three men stopped short and looked at one another. The one by the door hissed at the others to get moving, and in the blink of an eye, all three turned and bolted outside, vanishing into the curtain of night rain before the red and blue lights could sweep across the end of the block, leaving the door banging wildly in the wind and the diner littered with overturned chairs. Della stood rooted in place for several seconds, her legs weak, her whole body shaking now that the rush of adrenaline finally had somewhere to go. She grabbed the back of a chair to keep herself from collapsing, then suddenly remembered the old woman behind her and turned back in a hurry. And she saw that Mrs. Margaret wasn't all right. The silver-haired woman was leaning her whole weight against the tabletop, one hand pressed tightly over the left side of her chest, her face visibly paling, her breath breaking into short, urgent gasps. The shock of what had just happened had drained the last of her strength. Della rushed to her, catching her before she could slip from the chair, lowering her onto the floor as gently as she possibly could, her mouth calling over and over, "Ma'am, please stay awake for me. I'm here now, Mrs." Margaret's hand caught Della's wrist and squeezed weakly, her lips moving around something Della couldn't hear. Della pulled the phone from the pocket of her apron, her fingers clumsy from shaking, and called for an ambulance. When the voice on the other end answered, she gave the diner's address in a rushed but clear voice and said that an elderly woman was having a heart attack. Please come as fast as possible. While she waited, she did exactly what she had once picked up years earlier in a free first aid class at the community center. She loosened the woman's collar so she could breathe more easily, tucked a neatly rolled towel beneath her head, kept her lying still, and talked without stopping so she wouldn't drift away, telling her small, meaningless things for no reason except to let Della's voice anchor her to the present. "Mrs." Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her, her gaze cloudy but still trying to recognize the face of the young woman bending over her. And in that moment, something very strange passed through her eyes, as if she were seeing in Della something that both comforted her and wounded her. At last, the ambulance siren arrived outside the door, its flashing lights spilling across the diner, and two paramedics quickly came in with a stretcher and a medical bag. Della stepped back to make room for them, but when they were about to lift the old woman into the ambulance, Mrs. Margaret's hand still refused to release her wrist, holding on with a strength astonishing for someone who had just been so completely exhausted. Della didn't need to think. She hurriedly asked a neighbor to look in on Cora for her, then climbed into the ambulance, sitting down beside the strange woman whom fate had just placed in her hands, and the vehicle sped away through the rain, its siren crying out along the dark street. The hospital received Della with its cold white light and the familiar smell of disinfectant, a smell she had breathed in far too many times during the months she had taken Cora to dialysis. She sat down on a plastic chair outside the emergency ward, her hands still trembling, her apron still wrapped around her because she hadn't even had time to take it off, and she waited in silence while the doctors worked behind the double doors. She didn't know that old woman. She had no reason to stay, but she couldn't bring herself to leave when the woman's hand had still been clinging to hers in the ambulance, and when that pale face kept haunting her mind. About half an hour passed, and then the very air in the hallway suddenly changed. Several tall men in dark suits entered from the far end of the corridor, moving with a quiet decisiveness that made every nurse and patient passing by instinctively step aside. They spread out, securing every entrance and exit, and two of them came straight toward Della. One of them asked whether she was the person who had come here with Mrs. Marlowe. his voice not loud, but still enough to make her heart sink. Della stood up, her stomach twisting with a vague fear, thinking perhaps she had somehow gotten herself into trouble, that maybe they suspected she had something to do with what had happened at the diner. She stammered out an explanation, saying she was only the person watching the diner where the old woman had fainted, that she had brought her here because she couldn't bear to let her go alone. That was all. But the men didn't seem threatening. They simply stood there, silently watching, until the crowd parted slightly, and another man stepped forward. He was tall, his stride so calm it was almost frightening, his face cold and sharp, revealing no emotion at all, and the way the people around him subtly inclined their heads as he passed was enough for Della to understand that this was the man all of them obeyed. He stopped in front of her, his dark eyes looking straight into hers for a long moment, and there was something very strange in that gaze, as if he were seeing something he had long ago stopped believing still existed in this world. He introduced himself as Lucian Marlowe, the son of the woman she had just saved, and he thanked her for not abandoning his mother on a night like that. Della could only nod, awkwardly saying that she had only done what anyone would have done. Lucian gave a faint shake of his head and said no, not everyone would have done it, that he had lived long enough to know very few people would step into danger to shield a stranger. Then he told her about something she had never heard before, an old rule his family had kept for generations, that when someone saved the life of a Marlowe family member, that person was no longer a stranger, but became a benefactor to whom the entire family owed a lifelong debt, a debt of honor that couldn't be measured in money and must never be forgotten. He told her that from this moment on, whatever she needed, all she had to do was say it. Della stood still for a moment, and then she did something that made even the men in suits look briefly surprised. She refused. She said she didn't need anything, that she hadn't saved the old woman in hopes of being repaid, and that the only thing she wanted right now was to go home to her mother, who was also seriously ill and waiting for her. She said it simply, without calculation, without a trace of hesitation, as if being repaid or not had never once entered her mind. Then she gave a small bow and asked to be excused. Lucian didn't stop her. He only stood there, watching the slight young woman in the faded apron disappear down the white hallway, and for the first time in many years, something inside his chest stirred faintly, a curiosity mingled with something he couldn't name, because he had grown so used to people always wanting something from him that a person who wanted nothing at all suddenly became the most difficult thing he had ever encountered. In the world, Lucian Marlowe ruled, power rarely needed to make a sound. The next morning, on the highest floor of a glass building overlooking the Chicago River, he sat behind a dark wooden desk and listened as the men under him delivered their reports one after another. Not one of them dared sit until he gave the signal. Not one of them dared interrupt when he was speaking. He ran an entire network spread across the Midwest with short sentences, slight nods, and silences other people had learned how to read. When a business partner called with an arrogant tone, demanding to revisit an agreement that had already been signed, Lucian spoke only a few calm words into the phone, and the voice on the other end immediately changed, softened, backed down, and apologized again and again before hanging up. He didn't need to threaten anyone. The Marlowe name had been doing that work for him for a long time, because everyone in that world understood that this man never said anything he couldn't do. And it was that cold certainty, more than any spoken warning, that made people fear crossing him. Those who had once believed they could push him had all learned their lesson, and most of them had only needed to learn it once. Beside him throughout that morning stood Holt Brennan, the man who had served under the Marlowe family for nearly 20 years, the right-hand Lucian trusted more than anyone else left in the world. Holt was the only man allowed to enter Lucian's office without being announced. The only one Lucian entrusted with matters he would give to no one else. And that morning it was Holt who had arranged for extra guards around the hospital where Mrs. Margaret was lying, with such careful and considerate attention that no one had any reason to doubt him. When everyone else had withdrawn, leaving only the two of them in the spacious office, Holt poured Lucian a glass of water and asked after the old woman's health with what seemed like sincere concern. Then, almost in passing, he mentioned the girl from the diner and asked what Lucian intended to do about the person who had saved his mother. Lucian didn't answer right away. He rose from his chair, walked to the broad glass window, and looked down at the city spread out below him, the city he had held in his hands since he was far too young to understand the full price of owning it. In a low, distant voice, he said he had worn this iron face since he was 16 years old, The year his father fell and he was forced to become the man the whole world had to fear simply so he could survive, and that in all those years, no one had ever looked at him without seeing the Marlowe name first, without seeing the power and danger he carried with him. Holt listened in silence, his face revealing nothing. Lucian went on, saying that the girl was different, that when she looked at him in the hospital hallway the night before, she looked at him as if he were a person, simply a person, and that she had refused everything he offered without even needing to think, something he had never encountered in his entire life. Behind the cold shell the world always saw, Lucian Marlowe was a man tired down to his bones, tired of endlessly playing a role he could no longer remember beginning, tired of nights spent half asleep with a weight pressing on his chest, tired of the loneliness of being someone everyone needed but no one truly wanted to understand. Holt nodded slowly and said, "Perhaps Lucian should be careful, that someone almost impossibly good was sometimes the person most worth guarding against." Then he smiled and left the office with the air of an old friend merely worried for his master. Lucian remained alone by the window, paying little attention to that remark, his gaze still turned toward the distant South Loop, where there was a small diner and a girl in a faded apron, never knowing that the man who had just stepped out through the door behind him had already begun planting the first seeds of a conspiracy. A few days later, in the late afternoon when the diner had grown quiet and the customers had thinned out, Della left Maddox's corner to deliver a meal to an elderly neighbor at the end of the block, and it was there, on the narrow little road behind the row of old buildings, that she accidentally came upon a scene that made her press herself quickly against the corner of a wall. In front of a small shoe repair shop, where the husband and wife who owned it still worked hard day after day to support their family, a large man was blocking the entrance, his shrill voice ringing out with threats about a debt with a cutthroat interest rate that he had come to collect on behalf of someone else. He growled that if they didn't have the full amount by the end of the week, he would send people to clear out the entire shop, that poor people shouldn't dream of borrowing money and then dragging their feet, and every word he spoke made the poor shop owner tremble. His hands clasped together as he begged for just a few more days. Della stood frozen, her heart pounding hard, not knowing what she should do, only knowing that she was witnessing exactly the kind of oppression that people with money still poured down onto the heads of those who had nothing with which to defend themselves. But before she could think of any way to act, a dark car glided to the mouth of the alley and stopped, and from it stepped a figure she recognized at once. Lucian Marlowe. He walked forward, each step slow, unhurried, without raising his voice, and his very presence alone seemed to make the whole alley fall silent. The debt collector turned around, and the moment he realized who had just arrived, the arrogance drained visibly from his face. Lucian stopped a few steps away from him, both hands still in the pockets of his coat, and said only one sentence, his voice so low and quiet that Della had to hold her breath to hear it clearly, that this shop was in his neighborhood, and the people who lived here were under his protection. So the man had two choices. He could leave on his own right now, or he could stay and be responsible for that choice. He didn't shout, he didn't raise a hand. He only looked at the other man with eyes as flat and cold as the surface of a frozen lake, the kind of look that made it clear he was entirely serious, and that behind his courteous words was a weight no foolish man would want to test. The debt collector swallowed hard, stammered a few words, then tremblingly pulled the debt papers from his coat pocket and placed them in the shop owner's hands, mumbling that the debt could be considered erased, that he hadn't known who this place belonged to, and then he nearly ran out of the alley, not daring to look back even once. The shop owner stood motionless, clutching the papers that only moments earlier had been a sentence hanging over his whole family, then bowed deeply and thanked Lucian again and again. Lucian only gave a slight nod and said the man owed him nothing, that no one was allowed to come into this neighborhood and bully honest people, then turned as if to leave. And right then, his eyes met Della's as she stood tucked against the corner of the wall. She went rigid, not knowing whether to run or stay, her heart tangled between fear of the cold power she had just witnessed and something entirely different rising inside her, because she had just seen a man the world still called ruthless take action, but he hadn't acted to crush the weak. He had acted to stop someone who was crushing the weak, and he had done it without a single blow, only with his presence and a principle he had set for himself. Lucian walked toward her, stopped in front of her, and for a moment, the two of them only looked at each other in the empty alley as dusk began to settle. He said softly that he didn't want her to be afraid of him, that his world was full of ugly things, but he had never allowed himself to become one of those who preyed on people with nothing to fight back with. Della looked at him for a long time, and for the first time, she realized that the man standing before her was far more complicated than the frightening name she had once heard. A few days later, on an evening when the late fall rain was murmuring steadily beyond the front porch, and the diner had grown so quiet that only Della remained, wiping down the last of the tables, the door opened softly, and Lucian stepped inside, alone, without the men in suits who usually followed him. He stood uncertainly at the threshold for a moment, as if even he wasn't entirely sure why he had come here at this hour, then said he had only happened to be passing by, and noticed the diner lights were still on. Della looked at him, at the powerful man whom the whole city feared to cross, now standing in her small diner with a strange lostness about him, and for some reason she didn't understand. She found herself inviting him to sit, saying that the kitchen had already gone cold, but she could still make him something warm to eat. He sat down on the stool at the counter, and Della turned back into the kitchen, set a pot on the stove, and made him a bowl of chicken soup with a little crisp toasted bread, the simplest thing her foster mother used to make for her on the nights when she came home worn down to nothing. When she placed the steaming bowl in front of him, Lucian looked at it for a long while, then said quietly that it had been a very long time since anyone had cooked him a meal without some purpose behind it. He picked up the spoon and ate slowly, and in the warm silence of the little diner on that rainy night, something in him gradually began to loosen. He started to speak, hesitant at first, and then the words kept coming like water that had been held back for too long. He said he was tired in a way sleep couldn't cure, that every morning when he woke, he had to put on the man the world expected to see, and by nightfall he no longer knew how to take that man off. He said there were always people around him, servants, guards, people who needed him, people who feared him, but there had never been anyone who simply sat beside him and asked whether he was all right that day, and that the worst loneliness wasn't being alone, but standing in the middle of a crowd and still feeling utterly by yourself. Della listened without interrupting, without offering any hollow advice, simply sitting there with him, and when he finished, she said softly that she understood what it felt like to hold yourself together every day, so no one else could see how badly you were breaking inside, that she too still smiled at customers every morning while counting every dollar in her mind, and worrying about the mother lying upstairs, that sometimes strength was nothing more than something people were forced to carry because they had no other choice. Lucian lifted his eyes to her, and in that moment, between two people from worlds so impossibly far apart, an invisible thread seemed to draw tight, the thread of two souls wounded in different ways, and both far too accustomed to hiding it. He said he didn't understand why he was telling her these things he had never said to anyone before, and Della answered that perhaps it was because she didn't need anything from him, so he didn't have to keep his guard up. He gave a faint laugh, a real one, rare and weary, and for a brief instant, it made his cold, sharp face look far more human. They sat together for a long while longer in the small diner, talking about simple things, about the soup, about the sound of the rain, about things that had nothing to do with power or debt or the past, and for the first time in years, Lucian felt his chest grow lighter, as if the familiar weight pressing down on him had been lifted away for just a moment. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door, turned back to look at her, and thanked her, not for the bowl of soup, but for something larger that both of them understood, though neither had yet dared to name. Then he stepped out into the rain, leaving Della standing in the diner with a strange rhythm in her heart that she hadn't felt in a very long time. A few days after she was discharged from the hospital, despite the warnings of her son and her doctors, Mrs. Margaret returned to Maddox's corner on a morning washed in pale sunlight, walking more slowly than before, her face marked by a deeper weariness that no touch of makeup could hide. Della hurried to help her sit down at her familiar table by the window, meaning to scold her gently and say that she should have stayed home to rest, but the old woman only took her hand, shook her head, and said there were things she needed to say before she no longer had the chance. Della went still at those words, and when she looked into the old woman's eyes, she understood that Mrs. Margaret knew her time was no longer plentiful. She asked Della to sit beside her, and then, in a soft, broken voice, she began to tell her story. She said that her choice to come to this little diner over the past several months hadn't been as accidental as Della had always believed. She said she and Cora had known each other a very long time ago, back when they were both young women full of dreams, working together in a diner on the north side of the city. and that during the hardest years of her life, when she was at the end of her road and had no one left to hold on to, Cora had been the one who reached out, giving her a place to stay, a meal to eat, and a kindness she had never forgotten for the rest of her life. Then life carried the two women down different roads. Cora remained with her small diner and her honest heart, while Margaret was swept into another world, the world of her husband, of power and darkness, and she lost touch with her old friend for decades. Only recently, when she happened to learn that Cora was seriously ill and that the diner she had spent her whole life building was standing at the edge of ruin, did she come here, quietly, not daring to reveal herself, sitting only in the corner with her coffee and watching her old friend from a distance, because she wanted to silently repay the debt of kindness she had owed Cora since half a lifetime ago, yet she didn't know how to open her mouth after so many years of silence. Della listened as tears kept spilling from her eyes, and suddenly she understood the strange look Mrs. Margaret had always given her foster mother every time Cora forced herself downstairs. That heavy look filled with sorrow and regret, the look Della had wondered about for so long but had never been able to explain. Mrs. Margaret tightened her grip on Della's hand, and she said that on the night Della threw herself forward to shield her, she hadn't merely saved some strange old woman, she had saved the very friend Cora had always loved, and destiny truly had ways of arranging things that could leave a person speechless. Then her voice sank lower, and she spoke of the thing that weighed most heavily on her heart. She said she wasn't afraid of death, that she had lived long enough and seen enough, and that the only thing that wouldn't let her rest was the thought of leaving her son alone in the dark world that she and her husband had helped build around him. She said Lucian had been forced to carry too much when he was far too young, had been forced to smother the gentle part of himself in order to survive, and that for all these years she had only been able to watch helplessly as her son built one wall after another around his heart, unable to reach him no matter how hard she tried. But since meeting Della, she said, for the first time she had seen her son change, had seen in his eyes a kind of light she thought had gone out long ago, and that was why she had to say all of this today, because she needed Della to understand that she mattered to their family far more than she realized. Della wrapped her arms around the old woman, and the two women from two different generations held each other and cried quietly in the morning diner. In that embrace, there was gratitude, there was the loss already drawing near, and there was a thread of kindness stretching across decades, finally tied together again just as time was beginning to run out. Upstairs, as if sensing something, Cora forced herself down the stairs, and when she saw the face of the old friend sitting there, the two elderly women could only stare at each other in stunned silence, unable to speak, letting all the years they had buried inside break open in that late and aching moment of reunion. What neither Lucian nor Della knew was that, inside the private rooms of the city, a conspiracy had been quietly taking root long before that fateful night at the diner. Holt Brennan, the man who had stood behind the Marlowe family for nearly 20 years, the man Lucian trusted more than anyone else left in the world, had long been nursing an ambition he kept hidden beneath the flawless mask of loyalty. He had grown tired of forever being the shadow standing behind another man, forever being the one who carried out orders but never the one who held power, and in the bitterness that had gathered inside him through all those years, he began reaching out to his master's own enemy. In a discreet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, Holt sat across from Desmond Pike, a man with whom he shared every reason to want Lucian brought down. One craved power. The other craved the stretches of land that could be seized in one sweep, if only the Marlowe family could be pushed aside. Those two men shook hands in the dark, and Holt promised to open the way from within, while Pike would provide the money and the necessary pieces on the board, including the 3 men who had been sent to stir up trouble in the South Loop that night. The night Holt himself hadn't foreseen that Mrs. Margaret would be there, and that everything would turn in a direction no one had calculated. Now, seeing his master beginning to change, beginning to soften because of a girl who worked in a diner, Holt recognized both the danger and the opportunity in that same person, because if Lucian truly grew attached to Della, then she would become his weakness, and a weakness could always be turned into a weapon. So he began to act, not with knives or guns, but with whispers. One afternoon, when only the 2 of them remained in the office, Holt poured Lucian a glass of liquor. Then, with the hesitant air of an old friend forced to say something difficult, he told him that he had asked his people to look carefully into the girl from the diner, and that there were certain things he couldn't help worrying about for Lucian's sake. In a voice heavy with apparent sincerity, He said it was almost too much of a coincidence that the girl had appeared exactly where Lucian's mother happened to be, exactly when Desmond Pike was targeting that neighborhood, and that perhaps the heroic act that night had only been an elaborate performance meant to get her inside the trust of the Marlowe family. He released each sentence slowly, every word wrapped in the guise of loyal concern, every sentence like a tiny seed of poison planted in soil already made barren by the suspicion of a man who had spent his whole life among traitors. He reminded Lucian that in their world, kindness without a price was always the most suspicious thing of all, that everyone had their price, and that Lucian had paid dearly every time he allowed emotion to overtake reason. Lucian sat in silence, the glass of liquor in his hand never touching his lips, and although something inside him resisted, although he remembered the rainy night when she had made him that bowl of soup without asking anything in return, Holt's words still seeped into him like water through stone, because they had been spoken by the only man he trusted, and that was what made them more dangerous than any blade. Once the seed of doubt had been planted, it kept growing inside him, and in the days that followed, Della could clearly feel the change in him, without understanding why. Lucian no longer came by the diner. When they happened to meet again, the way he looked at her had changed, becoming guarded, distant, and cold, just as it had been in the beginning, as if the wall he had only just opened enough to let her step through had now slammed shut again. Once, when she took the initiative to ask how he was, he answered with only a few clipped words before turning away, leaving her standing there with a vague, bewildering hurt, wondering what she had done wrong. She didn't know that there was now an invisible shadow standing between her and that man. She didn't know that poisonous words had been whispered behind her back. She didn't know that the one smiling gently beside Lucian was the very person pulling every string. All she felt was her own heart, the heart that had only just dared to open after so many years of closing itself away, now aching again with the familiar pain of someone who had always feared that, sooner or later, she would be left behind too. In the days that followed, Lucian did the one thing he had spent his whole life learning to do whenever trust began to tremble. He quietly had his people find out everything about Della Hartley, turning over every page of her life as if he were opening a file. He wanted to uncover the truth for himself, wanted to prove or disprove the words Holt had whispered to him, and somewhere deep inside him, though he wouldn't admit it, a part of him desperately hoped those words were wrong. His men dug through her past, watched her daily steps, recorded every place she went, every person she met, and each report that came back painted the same picture, the picture of a young woman working herself to exhaustion in a failing diner, a young woman with no savings account worth mentioning, no suspicious connections, no trace of the deception Holt had implied. Della was only who she appeared to be, a poor woman carrying a sick mother and a dying diner on her shoulders. Nothing more and nothing less. But the seeds of doubt Holt had planted hadn't completely dissolved inside Lucian, and he still kept his distance, still didn't allow himself to believe fully, and that hesitation pushed him away from her at the very moment when she needed something steady to lean on more than ever. As for Della, she felt that sudden coldness clearly, and it hurt her in the way she had once promised herself she would never allow herself to be hurt again. She didn't understand why the man who had once sat in the rainy night diner and told her about his loneliness now looked at her as if she were a stranger. And on the nights when she lay awake unable to sleep, she tormented herself with the thought that perhaps she had been foolish to let her heart open to someone so far beyond her reach, that perhaps she should have known good things weren't meant for people like her. But she didn't have time to drown in that sorrow, because every morning the diner still had to open. Cora still needed medicine, still needed the dialysis treatments whose costs were piling higher and higher, and the numbers still refused to add up to enough. She swallowed her hurt, tied back her hair, put on her apron, and kept moving forward the way she always had. Then the blow came on a gray afternoon, when a mail carrier brought a thick envelope to the diner bearing the seal of a law office. Della opened it, and each cold line of text seemed to drain the air from her lungs. The entire building where the diner stood had been sold to a new company, and the new owner behind that company's name was none other than Desmond Pike. The letter stated that Maddox's Corner's lease would be terminated, that they had exactly 30 days to move out and return the premises, with no negotiation and no extension. 30 days to end 31 years of Cora's sweat and tears. 30 days to erase the only place Della had ever been allowed to call home. She stood in the middle of the diner, clutching the paper tightly in her hand, and a bitter feeling rose until it choked her throat. In the panic and hurt piling one on top of the other, Her mind began connecting the wrong points, and a terrible thought slipped in. She remembered Lucian's sudden coldness, remembered how he had abruptly withdrawn from her life just as disaster came crashing down, and a bitter voice inside her whispered that perhaps it had all been an act, that perhaps he and Pike had been on the same side all along, that perhaps the kindness he had once shown her was only the way powerful men entertained themselves before crushing the weak. She had no proof, only pain and fear twisting everything out of shape. But for someone who had spent her whole life being betrayed and left behind, suspicion always came far more easily than trust. That night, Della sat alone in the darkened diner, the notice lying in front of her, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt completely alone. The trust that had only just begun to bloom in her heart had now cracked apart, leaving her to stand against the storm coming down on her without knowing where she could possibly hold on. It was on that very night, while Della sat alone in the darkened diner with the notice lying before her, that across the city, Lucien Marlowe was turning through the final file his men had sent back to him, and page by page, those papers were quietly crushing the seeds of doubt Holt had worked so carefully to plant. Laid bare before him was Della's entire life, the childhood years of being passed from one house to another, the small wages she earned and poured into Cora's medicine, the shifts that stretched late into the night, while she carried everything alone without a single word of complaint. There were no secret accounts, no suspicious meetings with Pike's people, not one piece that fit the story of a planted spy. There was only the simple, aching truth that she was exactly the person she had always shown herself to be, poor and kind, in a way that, in his world, was almost impossible to believe. Lucien sat motionless for a long time, and regret rose inside him like a tide, cold and heavy. He had wrongfully suspected the only woman who had ever looked at him as a human being. He had pushed her away at the very moment she needed him most, and he had done it because of whispers from a man he trusted. And from that very thought, another chill crept down his spine. He began tracing everything backward, asking himself why Holt had been so eager to seed suspicion about Della, why his warnings had aligned so strangely with every move Desmond Pike had made, why the three men who caused trouble that night had known the exact hour when the diner would be close to closing. He had his people quietly recheck Holt's meetings over the past several months, and the scattered pieces began to gather into a picture that turned his heart cold. The picture of a betrayal coming from the very place he had never thought to look, from the man who had stood beside him for nearly 20 years. But Lucien had survived this world long enough to understand that one mustn't startle a snake before taking hold of its head, so he kept everything hidden. On the surface, he still allowed Holt to believe he was winning, while in silence, he began tightening the net around him. At the same time, Lucien turned his attention to the two women he had neglected, and what he discovered made his heart twist even harder, because Cora's kidney disease had moved into a critical stage. Dialysis was no longer enough to hold it back, and the doctors said that unless a compatible donor kidney could be found soon, her remaining time would be counted in weeks. Lucien knew Della was facing all of that alone, fearing the loss of her mother and the loss of the diner, while also misunderstanding him, and the weight of those things made it impossible for him to sit still for even one more minute. He acted quietly, in his own way, without display, without needing anyone to know. He used every connection and every resource he had to speed up the search through the donor list, to make sure Cora was given priority for compatibility testing, to ensure that the enormous costs of the coming surgery would be paid in silence, without anyone ever knowing who stood behind it. He didn't do it so Della would be grateful to him, nor did he do it simply to ease his guilt. He did it because, for the first time in his life, he truly wanted to protect something clean from being crushed by his world. Standing beside the tall glass window and looking down at the city glittering with lights, Lucien slowly clenched his hand, and a cold resolve rose in his eyes. He would repair the mistake he had made with Della. He would keep Cora alive, and he would make the people who had set a trap for her pay the price, even if one of them was the man he had once regarded as a brother. But he understood that the storm had only just begun, that Holt and Pike wouldn't stop, and that before everything ended, there would be one more price to pay. A price that even he, with all his power, couldn't possibly foresee. Holt Brennan decided to strike the final blow on a weekend night, when he believed every piece on the board had fallen into its proper place. He arranged a false meeting, telling Lucien that he had traced the true figure behind Pike, and that Lucien needed to come personally to an old warehouse by the docks to settle the matter once and for all. A trap already laid where Holt and Pike's men would be waiting to remove him and seize the entire organization. He calculated every detail, choosing a deserted place, an hour no one would notice, and he was certain that the man who had trusted him for nearly 20 years wouldn't suspect the invitation in the slightest. But Holt had made one fatal mistake he didn't even know about. A few days earlier, when Della had gone to deliver food to a small office in the neighborhood, she had accidentally overheard a fragment of conversation through a door left slightly ajar, the voice of the very man who had accompanied Lucian several times before, discussing a warehouse, the Marlowe name, and how everything would end on the weekend night. At first, she didn't understand it all, but those broken pieces lodged in her mind, and when she put them together with the uneasy feeling that had been pressing on her for so long, a terrifying truth emerged and sent a chill down her spine. Someone was planning to hurt Lucian, and the person behind it was the man he trusted most. Della stood before a choice that tore at her heart. That man had been cold to her, had pushed her away, and a part of her was still hurting because of it. But when she imagined him walking straight into that trap without knowing, her heart wouldn't allow her to stand still. She didn't have his phone number. She had no way to contact him directly, so she did the only thing she could think to do. She ran. She ran to the glass building she had once heard mentioned, begging the guards to let her see him. And when they stopped her, she shouted in the middle of the lobby that Lucian's life was in danger, that there was a trap at a warehouse by the docks, that Holt was the traitor. The news finally reached Lucian just as he was preparing to leave. And though he had already been quietly suspicious of Holt, the fact that Della was the one who had risked herself to come warn him made him understand two things at once: that the trap was real, and that the girl he had wrongly suspected had placed his safety above her own pain. Lucian didn't walk into the trap the way Holt expected. He went to that warehouse, but he went in his own way, with the truly loyal men already positioned, and when Holt and Pike's men believed their prey had been caught in the net, they were the ones who found themselves surrounded. The clash broke out in the darkness of the old warehouse, shadows rushing at one another amid shouted orders and the heavy thunder of running feet, a fierce struggle between loyalty and betrayal. Lucian moved through all that chaos with the cold calm of a man who had known danger too well for too long, and one by one, Pike's men were subdued. When everything was settled, only Holt remained standing there, the face that had always worn the look of loyalty now twisted with rage and despair. As he realized his scheme had completely collapsed, Lucian stepped toward the traitor, and he didn't need to strike him. He only looked at him with the eyes of a man who had just lost the thing he had trusted most, then asked him a single question: whether through all those years there had ever truly been brotherhood between them, or whether all of it had only been the patient waiting of a man lying in ambush. Holt didn't answer, and his silence said everything. Lucian ordered his men to take him away, along with every piece of evidence of his collusion with Desmond Pike, a complete downfall that didn't need meaningless bloodshed, but came instead through the very net Lucian had quietly woven beforehand. When everything fell silent, Lucian stepped out of the warehouse beneath the night sky, and the first thing he thought of wasn't victory, wasn't the organization he had kept intact, but the face of the girl who had run with all her strength across half the city just to save him. The girl who had shielded his mother on that fateful night long ago, and who had now, once again, stepped forward to protect him, closing a circle of grace and debt that no words could ever measure. But just when the storm had finally quieted, and it seemed as though peace had at last returned, Mrs. Margaret's weary heart no longer had the strength to hold on. She had endured long enough to see the thing she had wished for most, long enough to know that her son had turned his back on darkness and chosen the light. And once that had come to pass, it seemed she finally allowed herself to let go. On a late fall morning, they found her lying peacefully in bed, as if she were asleep, her face strangely serene, with no trace of pain or worry left upon it, only the quiet calm of someone who had laid down the final burden of her life. Lucian came to his mother's bedside, and the man the whole city had once feared, the man who hadn't let anyone see him weak for so many years, knelt beside her and wept. For the first time since the year he had been forced to become an adult far too soon, silent tears rolling down his face, while he made no effort to wipe them away. Beside him, Della placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because she understood that there were sorrows before which every word of comfort became unnecessary, and her quiet presence in that moment set everything in their place. On the small table beside the bed, Mrs. Margaret had left two things. One was a neatly folded letter with Della's name on it, and beside it lay an old handkerchief, yellowed with time, something Della would later learn was the very handkerchief Cora had given Margaret during those hard days long ago, a keepsake she had guarded for decades, as if guarding a promise that had never been fulfilled. With trembling hands, Della opened the letter, and in each line of writing, already somewhat unsteady from the weakness in Margaret's hand, Mrs. Margaret wrote that she thanked Della not only for the night she had shielded her, but for something far greater, for giving her son back a heart she had thought had hardened forever. She wrote that she was leaving with a lighter soul, because she knew Lucian would no longer have to be alone in that cold world, that in Della she had found the young woman she had always hoped would one day enter her son's life, and that although fate hadn't allowed her to stay long enough to call Della her daughter-in-law, in her heart, Della had been family from the moment she stepped forward to protect a strange old woman, without needing any reason at all. She asked Della to keep the handkerchief as a thread joining the three women whom fate had bound together across several decades: Cora, Margaret, and now Della. When Della finished reading, her tears fell and blurred the words on the page, and she pressed the letter tightly against her chest, feeling that within that loss there was also a warm love the old woman had passed on to her like one final gift. Mrs. Margaret's funeral was quiet and solemn, and among those who came to see her off was Cora, who only a few weeks before had still been confined to bed, seemingly unlikely to survive. Because amid all those overwhelming events, the kidney transplant Lucian had quietly arranged had finally succeeded. A compatible donor kidney had been found just in time, and every cost had been fully handled by a hidden hand whose owner Cora would only learn about much later. Her health gradually returned, and now she stood there, trembling as she leaned on her foster daughter's arm, silently saying goodbye to the old friend she had barely found again, before having to part from her once more. The two old friends had finally met again after being lost to each other for decades, though it was only a brief reunion before one of them had to leave. But perhaps for both of them, seeing each other one more time, holding each other's hand one more time, was the very thing they had quietly longed for all their lives. Lucian stood beside his mother's grave for a long time after everyone else had gone, and when he turned to look at Della, who was standing quietly beneath the trees shedding their leaves as she waited for him, he understood that the woman to whom his mother had entrusted her final faith was also the woman his own heart had chosen long ago. After the days of mourning, when grief slowly settled into a quiet ache of remembrance, Lucian came to the diner one afternoon, no longer wearing the cold, guarded look of those days of misunderstanding, but carrying an honesty he had never allowed anyone to see in all his life. He apologized to Della, without circling around it, without defending himself. He said plainly that he had been wrong to let suspicion blind him to what his heart had already known, that he had pushed her away at the very moment she needed him most, and that he didn't expect her to forgive him right away. He only hoped she would give him a chance to prove who he truly was. Della looked at him for a long time, and in the eyes of the man who had once made an entire city afraid, she no longer saw a cold wall, but a wounded sincerity she understood couldn't be faked. She gave a small nod, and that was all he needed. But Lucian understood that words alone weren't enough, that if he truly wanted to be worthy of her and of the final trust his mother had placed in her, he had to change the life he was living from its very roots. He began doing something no one before had dared imagine. He set out on a long and difficult path to bring all of his operations out of the shadows, step by step turning toward legal fields, real estate, restaurant chains, respectable businesses he could one day speak of to her with pride. He knew this wasn't something that could be finished overnight, that removing what had been rooted deep for decades would take many years and no small amount of danger, that there would still be people who didn't want him to leave, and bridges he would have to burn along the way. But for the first time, he had a reason large enough to begin, and he began with unwavering resolve. He told Della he didn't promise everything would change in a day or two, but he promised he would walk that road one step at a time, until he became the kind of man she could stand beside with peace in her heart. Then he did something that left Della completely stunned. He placed a folder on the table in front of her, and when she opened it, she realized it held all the paperwork for the building where Maddox's corner stood, the very building Desmond Pike had bought, in order to force them into the street. Lucian had quietly bought the whole thing back, and now he was transferring it to Cora and Della, entirely, without keeping any part of it for himself. Della stared up at him in disbelief, stammering that she couldn't accept something so enormous, that it was too much. But Lucian only gently pushed the folder toward her and said he wasn't doing this as a debt to be repaid or as a way to bind her to him, but because he wanted her to be free, wanted her to have a place that truly belonged to her, a place no one could ever take from her again. He said he chose her not because she needed him, but because he wanted her to be safe and happy whether she chose to stay beside him or not. It was that unconditional tenderness that made Della break down in tears, because in all her life, no one had ever given her anything without conditions or calculation hidden behind it. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and in that embrace, two people who had once stood at opposite ends of life finally found each other. Not because of an old debt of grace, not because of the trials that had bound them together, but because something true had grown between them, forged through loss and tested by pain. Lucian gently pressed his cheek against her hair and whispered that from now on, she wouldn't have to carry everything alone anymore, that he would be there, not as a powerful boss, but simply as a man willing to walk beside her through all the days still to come. And for the first time in many years, both of them felt that the road ahead was filled with light. 6 months later, Maddox's corner had come back to life in a way no one in the neighborhood had ever dared to dream. The renovation had preserved the old soul of the diner, the familiar wooden tables, the simple menu with its generous portions, the warm atmosphere Cora had spent 31 years building. Only now the kitchen had been properly repaired. The lights glowed warmer, and laughter had returned to fill every small corner. Cora's recovery was visible in every part of her complexion rosy again, her steps steadier, and each morning she sat by the counter, sipping a cup of tea and chatting with the regulars as she had in the old days. Recovering after the kidney transplant felt as though life had given her a second chance, and she lived each day of it with deep gratitude. But the most beautiful thing to grow from everything they had endured was a simple idea of Della's. She decided to use this little diner, the very place where Cora had once taken her in, to open free vocational classes every weekend for young people in the neighborhood who came from difficult circumstances, teenagers who had grown up with too little yet still longed for a chance to rise. She taught them how to make a proper cup of coffee, how to bake fragrant batches of pastries, how to serve tables and speak to customers with kindness, and most important of all, she taught them that no matter where they came from, every person deserved respect and could build a decent future with their own two hands. On those weekend afternoons, the diner rang with the bright voices and laughter of the young people, their still tender faces lighting up with joy the first time they created something of their own, and Della watched them with a happiness filling her heart unlike anything she had ever known. Lucian often stopped by at those times, no longer a powerful boss surrounded by guards, but simply a man with his sleeves rolled up, awkwardly learning how to make coffee under Della's guidance, so clumsy that the whole diner burst into laughter, and he laughed with them, a light, relieved laugh belonging to a man who had finally found a place of peace for his heart. His journey out of the darkness still stretched far ahead, and there were still many hardships waiting on that road. But every day he took another step, and he walked that path with a determination that never wavered. The story of Della and Lucian, of Cora and Margaret, reminds us of one simple yet profound truth, that kindness is never meaningless, that even the smallest act of goodness can plant the seed of miracles we could never foresee, and that even in the darkest places, when kindness is protected and cherished, it can still take root, blossom, and bear fruit. More than anything, this story reminds us that a person's dignity is never measured by wealth or poverty, but by the way they treat others with love and kindness. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like and share it so that kindness can spread to even more people, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that each day you can hear more meaningful and moving stories. How do you feel about today's story, and which part moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always read and treasure every line you share with us. Thank you for being here and listening until the very last minute. May you and your loved ones always be blessed with abundant health, joy, peace, and serenity in every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.